Hello, I'm Brad.
And I'm Jason.
You are listening to
Dice in Mind.
You and I have talked. Oh goodness. I mean, this goes back before the podcast, going back to even before we started thinking about playing role playing. It goes back to the days when probably you still kept your Star Wars, your D6, your West End game around, where we talked about how we loved to read RPG materials as like resource. And it's funny because you're the one that introduced me to, they weren't RPG books, but they were the technical manuals for DS9.
Oh, yes.
And for the Enterprise D.
Yep. And the TOS tech manual where it all started.
And you had them already. I ordered them and bought them way back at our favorite bookstore.
Otto on Court Books.
Yep, in the mid 90s in Bayside, Wisconsin.
Beautiful.
But I picked up a couple. I picked up my copy of West End Games, Star Wars, the role-playing game, at that same bookstore around the same time.
Well,
because we had talked about potentially at some point doing some playing, but I was working, you were busy in college. There wasn't time for it.
No.
The more we've played, and the more we've done this podcast, the more we realize that, and excuse me, boy, well, I can't edit that out. A lot of times I buy my material not expecting for us to play it, but because I love to read the material.
Clearly, I've seen your bookshelf, but truly, you do. Yeah. We both do.
I mean, you just recently picked up because, and we'll talk more about this in the future. We have been actually truly playing Star Trek Adventures.
Actually playing
it. Jason is game mastering. It's a duet environment. It's working really well.
So fun.
And it's a unique environment because I think when I mentioned to you how I kind of wanted to position my character you were surprised at the direction I was going to go, which was more in a science direction. And you just picked up the Sciences Division book.
I did. And
it's as much to read it as to
oh yeah. I told you it's knowing that I could use it as a resource in our game was that final push of justification for me to spend the money, though it's not an expensive source book at all. But I'm looking at it because it's on my shelf. I flipped through it. I haven't been back to it. Got a little more writing tomorrow morning, and then I'm glad you brought this up because I think this week I'll start to read through it because it's just interesting to read, even if it doesn't show up in the game.
Well, and another one that I think we both agree has been lit for us is Utopia Planatia.
Oh yeah.
And for me, Green Ronin's The Expanse RPG.
Yep. And I would add to that, we talked about this before, but it's been some time. Going back to West End and the D6 system, the original Star Wars West End Games Game Mastery Guide, which I still think is one of the best ever written. It's so, reading it is like almost moving through scenes in a Star Wars film, right? Original trilogy. And then what I think about Worlds of Android.
Yeah, and even
pure literature.
The first edition, you picked up the first edition D&D reprint, AD&D.
After you did, After you
the Game Master Guide there. That was another one. And that one's a very busy book, but it is still great resource.
Now, why are we talking about this?
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
So long wraparound is we've always been fans of, and we've used the kind of the phrase RPG as lit. RPG as literature, meaning using RPG material and sitting down and reading it like you would fiction, nonfiction, whatever, not necessarily intending to play.
Right.
And a lot of my material, and there is a lot, was done with that intent. Because I love reading the mechanics, the history. People, I mean, I've talked about RuneQuest and the history of that.
Burning Wheel.
Burning Wheel.
Right.
Oh, Burning Wheel's a great, interesting one.
I mean, let's be honest, you never really were interested, not primarily in playing that. This was about reading it, being immersed in it.
And I'll be honest with you, this sounds almost a little, you and I are a big fan, even in the days of PDFs and Kindles and everything, which I do love.
Yeah.
But we're a big fan of the printed book.
Yeah, still am. Big fan.
Which is why, even though I have, I got the PDFs for the Star Trek books with the purchase of the book, I still use the book.
Right.
Primarily. Right. Same thing with when you order from Green Ronin.
Yep. Oh yeah.
And not only do I find reading it interesting, but I also look at it as what is the aesthetic, and we've talked about it, of the material. And what drew my eye to Burning Wheel as an example is the way they...
Yep. It's just elegant.
It's very elegant in terms of how they presented it and how they've written the material.
Mm-hmm.
So this is something we've talked about. And after we talked with Jim Johnson, he made a point when we were talking offline. He's like, "Oh, that would be an interesting topic," and it was literally kind of the
light bulb went off for both of us.
Yeah, the spark we needed. Him mentioning that, it was the spark we needed to actually act on something that we've been talking about doing for a while.
Because honestly, I mean, you and I have talked about this for so long, as you said, and as we said to Jim, it's like, well, we honestly thought. I mean, this sounds really stupid in retrospect, but I think you and I really thought that this is not the norm. And we know, we've talked to people in previous interviews. We've seen truly just a little bit online about this notion of RPGs as literature, and we want to be careful here because there is this area called lit RPG, and sometimes people mean that like we do, like reading RPGs as literature. Sometimes people mean it as just a different take on RPGs, like Sense and Sensibility with dice, and that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about RPGs as literature. But for the longest time, you and I thought, well, this is probably not a mainstream kind of thing, but it turns out there are a lot of people who are talking about this.
And there's a lot. And so we both started doing our research to find some folks that would love to come on and talk about this,
or who could be cheaply bribed. Let's call it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's good. And we found a couple of names. The first one that came up was for me, and it was Emily Care Boss.
Yeah,
and we've known about Emily for quite a while.
Yep.
We just never thought we'd invite her because she would say yes to us.
And it's also hard to tell with a lot of people out there, a lot of prominent people and accomplished people in the RPG and adjacent arenas, that they are thinking about this, because it's not RPGs as literature. It's not something that many people are talking about, writing about, posting about, ignoring that irony. And so it's been hard to find, even just to identify people who might be in it, much less willing to talk about it.
Yeah, and people who write the material, are they writing it with that idea, or are they writing it with in a different mindset or for a different reason?
Yeah.
So Emily was very gracious enough to join us. She loved the idea. In fact, that's one of the first things she mentioned when we all connected before we hit the record button.
Yeah.
Was this idea of talking about it. And as we have seen with so many of our guests, we could have kept talking well past the scheduled time.
In fact, we did keep her too late, but we'll correct that by having her back.
Yes. Yeah. So it was really great conversation. It was one of those where after the conversation, Jason, we were both honest and we were like, well, I think we need to pause before we record some of our discussion and analysis, because we need to kind of digest the conversation, because it was that. I
mean, you called me out during the interview. You're like, I think he's having a moment of like, you can see him processing, but it was just so darn interesting. And we both get into that. I mean, how often does one encounter something that's truly novel, no pun intended, and try to integrate that into your understanding of this stuff. So I think we should hop on over.
Yeah, we'll have all the information for her, blackgreengames.com.
Yep.
She's obviously an accomplished writer. She has a very interesting background and career outside of this. What you'll hear us talk about.
We'll get into it. Yep.
And after the interview, we'll talk a bit more about this.
Emily Cairboss is an independent role-playing game designer, publisher, and conservationist, living on land of the Wabanaki Dawnland Confederacy in western Massachusetts of the United States. Emily's designs include Breaking the Ice, Shooting the Moon, and Under My Skin, which won the Player's Choice Otto Award at Fastaval in 2009. These games were published in a single-volume compendium with additional hacks and mods as the Romance Trilogy in 2016 and earned a nomination for the Diana Jones Award for Excellence in Gaming in 2017. An early participant at the Forge forums and a proponent of independent publishing, Emily founded JiffyCon in 2006, a regional role-playing game convention showcasing independent and small press games.
Emily, thanks for joining us today. I really appreciate it. We both do. We want to talk about your as a writer, as an RPG writer, and there's so much more. So thank you so much again for taking the time with us this evening.
Appreciate being here. I'm looking forward to talking about games and literature and the world and whatever.
So how did you I'm gonna toss out the main question to start is how did you end up getting into the realm of writing games and writing about games as well? Not only do you design them, but you write about games as well, even beyond that. So
let's see, I think it sort of starts together. I started playing games in college. I didn't play when I was younger. A lot of people start like in their teenage years. And I did a lot of having a box and reading it and then never playing. So for me, it came a little later. And I fell in with some friends who were on the internets early in the years of 1990s. And
early.
Yeah, really freaking early with the, having to plug in through the phone and being loud and having one phone line.
Yeah.
So
that's Jason and I.
The
same way.
Awesome.
Yeah. And we had a big household of a whole mess of us that piled in and lived together during college. So we could pay almost nothing to live there.
Nice.
And they were role-playing game geeks. They had already hacked hacked several systems together and then made their own world and had been playing for several years. And so they invited me in and it was like a playground because I, as a kid, was a total geek and always had a book, always had my nose buried in a book and just loved fantastic worlds. I love sci-fi, I love fantasy. And so it was awesome to be able to play in a world with other people. How perfect is that? And they were involved, several of them were involved in a news group, if that's the right phrase, if I'm remembering correctly.
Oh yeah, I remember.
Dedicated to talking about fantasy role-playing games. And it was really, really fascinating. I loved it. I was like, oh my God, they're talking about how it works and what you do. And it was really, at that particular group of people talking about things, was very interested in good, robust ways to play, robust ways to run a game and deal with the world and deal with the issues that come up between players and GMs and everything like that. And that conversation morphed a little and started again in the early 2000s on a place called the Forge. And that conversation, there was a sort of a new community that really had paid attention to, and some had participated in the earlier conversations, but this conversation was focused more on design with the intent to publish, which is a different conversation.
Interesting. So what makes that different as a conversation?
Well, what came to my mind actually was something later for me when I got interested in live action play and learned about how the differences between playing at a table and playing live with people. And I got all excited about improv because I was like, improv must be like this. Let's do that. But the difference between improv and role playing, making analogies here, you have to forgive me, is that you're playing for each other when you're playing a role playing game. And you're playing for an audience when you're playing when you're doing improv.
Right,
They call it playing, even though it's theater, it's playing, whatever. I don't know. I'm not an actor. So looking back at design for play and design for publication, again, it's that shift where who's your audience?
Yeah.
And there's an external audience that you're looking at. And, you know, on the Forge, we were like little punks, you know, like 20 people would buy our game. So it wasn't like we were, you know, looking at huge audiences. But no, some games went on and did quite well. Vincent and Meg Baker have done amazing things with the Apocalypse World, and there's many, many, many games that are based on that system. So there's been a lot of great successes from those pretty small humble roots. Well, and that's where it started for me.
Speaking of humility, I mean, now correct me if I'm wrong here, you weren't just like there for the early Forge. You're a founding member.
Am I? I'm like early. I guess I'm early. I think, sure, yeah, say that. I'm a founding member. I was involved. I was deep. I stuck my arm in way, and I like rolled all in it and got it up in my hair. So I did start at the early days. So I guess I am a founding member, whatever that means. But you know, and it didn't work for everybody. You know, it like bounced some people off, and it was very white, and you know, it was like a lot of spaces, welcoming or not welcoming, depending on who you were. And I felt grateful to have found people that I connected with, and I really, really got a lot out of it, but recognized that there are limitations to everything. But what some of the things that were great about the things that were there were that we really were devoted to helping each other. And there was a lot of feeling of reciprocity and honest reaching out to one another and helping each other and playing each other's games, and, you know, like working together to be able to go to cons, which none of us could have afforded alone. And so that made a huge difference. Having that community that we met through online spaces allowed many of us to access, you know, things that we never would have otherwise.
That's cool.
As you were out on the Forge and you were starting to do this games, the game development and all that, you know, if you don't mind, how did, you know, like you said, you always had a book in your hand, very similar to Jason and I as well. We were the same way. How did your experience and, you know, as a fan of literature and as a reader and all that kind of play into what kind of games you wanted to develop?
Well, let's see. Going back to that group of friends I played games with in college, there was a certain level of world that they were indulging in and engaging in that felt a lot like, you know, fantasy or science fiction series that I had read. One of my friends, brilliant person, had done this genealogy of all the mages. We were using Ars Magica or Magica, whatever, as the system, or one of the systems that was squidged together. And so that person had written this genealogy of the mages all the way back to founding in this original world that they created, which is, you know, kind of evokes Tolkien with all his, you know, these elves and those elves and dwarves and everything. And I loved that. I was like, oh, this is the good stuff. You know, we're reading the appendices here and we're living in them.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Did you, you know, as you're doing your game design and being out there, did you kind of gravitate towards certain types of genres or certain types of gameplay, or, you know, you have a broad swath, I'm, you know, just based off of, you know, everything that you've written and everything like that. I'm just curious, kind of as you kind of developed as a game designer, did you kind of feel like you were steering yourself in a direction, or were you trying to just kind of mix around? Or
I really love to try anything. I really, really love to have a lot of experiences. And I think it really helps you have new ways of looking at the world and creating. But for myself, I really wanted to have strong emotional experiences. I loved games that I felt that, like, you know, knifed me in the gut. And left me lying bleeding in the gutter, crying. And I also loved, like it works for me when I feel the character, whatever that means. That works for me, and so I was definitely an advocate of playing games that allowed you to enter into them and that weren't about surface, but that allowed you on whatever way to get deeper in. So I think I've always loved games that do that. And some of that is allowing the games to be about things that aren't fun per se, but that are more serious or harder or more emotional, that give you a sort of an experience that is not just angsty because your favorite horse got killed as you went into battle. That's a terrible thing. That sucks. I've had that happen in game and it's bad. But there's other things you can be sad about that are like, and this I feel like gets a little bit to the thinking about games as literature or narrative experience, because there's so many different things that one loves to watch in a film, one loves to read in a book. Why shouldn't you do the same with role-playing games? Why shouldn't you want to have a broad experience?
Absolutely.
And so that's always been what's interested me.
You segued awesome there, because one of the things we talked about just before we hit the record button is this idea as RPGs and gaming as literature or within the realm of literature. And that's something that Jason and I have a passion for, and we've talked about here and there. And you kind of talked about it even with, talking about, like, in effect, what you were exactly talking about, this history of mages, the appendix stuff. That's the stuff you aren't gaming that, you're reading that, and you're reading the fantasy of others that you could in fact then apply if you wanted to in a gaming environment. Did that also, this idea of, and maybe I'm overlapping on the prior question a bit, did that also kind of drive your kind of development as a writer, development as a gaming writer, and so on?
Yeah, I'm not trained as a writer in any way. I don't know why I did what I did. I just did it. It seemed fun. My background is in social thought and political economy. That was my undergraduate major, whatever that is.
Well, so fiction. No, just kidding.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's all games. And then I went into the environmental fields, and I'm a forester and a conservationist now. But I guess it's because I read ravenously as a child, and I've always loved literature, and I've always loved fiction, just as breathing, I wasn't studying it per se, but I was living it. And as an adult, I definitely find that helps me write, because there's all of this experience that I have of worlds and words that just comes out through my fingers when I'm lucky. Wow. But for writing games, I did actually, for my first actual game that I wrote and published, which I tried to keep real small, and then mushrooms, was Breaking the Ice. And it was a game for 2 players, and you play 2 people going on their first 3 dates, and you see if it works out or not. Hey. And I, when I started writing it, I was like, oh, okay, we're making these characters and they're going to go on 3 dates. And I sat down with a friend and I was like, okay, let's make characters. And he looked at me blankly and was like, what do you want me to do now, Emily? How do I make a character for this game? What, and so I set the pen down. I said, okay, let's come back to this later. And then, and then I said, okay, so I need some creative prompts here. It's not the kind of game where you can go, okay, you're a cleric, blah, 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 blah. That's not, you can get to that later, but initially, if you're just trying to write 2 people from your world who are going to go on 2 dates, what is it about them that's going to hook you as a player? What is it about them that's going to create some drama, that creates a narrative line and, movement change and internal change and things like that? And so I started really simply with what's their favorite color? You'd pick the favorite color for each of the characters. And then each of you helps the other person do some free association off that color. And then you use that as this field of ideas that can help you sort of just say, green, trees and nature. All right, maybe maybe they like to hike, maybe that's their hobby, that they like to hike. And maybe that's how these two met. They met on a trail, on a mountain or something. So that's sort of a kind of, seems like a common writing exercise technique, where you might just have some kind of free association that gets your juices going. And then within, as you make the character, then you figure out for each of the characters as you make them, you say, what is it right now that's making it maybe challenging for them to date anybody? Not this other person, just anybody. Maybe they just broke up, maybe they have some issues, maybe they lost their job, and so they're just feeling challenged in general. So just something that then you can also bring that to the table. So you've got who they are, what's challenging them, and then you bring them together. And then when I tried, play testing it, someone else was like, oh, okay, yeah, I can see where this is. I can see what a character might be. Wow. Now we're going to try and figure out how these two mesh or don't mesh. And the dice are going to give us like grist for that mill. And it worked. But, like just coming to the table, like, give me a character that's going to go on 3 days. No, I need some help here. And so things that one might use if you're writing a story about two characters, for me, felt like natural things to bring in to help the players create character for play.
Wow. I mean, when
go ahead, Jay.
I was just gonna say when you started, it's like I created a role-playing game based on a bunch of first dates, and I'm like, well, that sounds almost as bad as real life. But now that you explained it, I mean, it sounds, I mean, it goes back to the lit RPG thing, doesn't it? It just sounds very like almost literary criticism, which is funny because, like you said, that's not actually or it wasn't actually your background. That's really cool. I mean, it obviously applicable to anything someone would want to write or design, because presumably it's a similar thought process, right? Just in a different context. Exactly.
And I someday will write more about this, but I feel very strongly that game design is narrative analysis, that is what we're doing when we sit down and think about, like, a lot of games are inspired by, a movie or a series, or, like when you think about, you two were talking about playing the Star Trek role-playing game, then somebody had to think about, how does it function? What are the characters? What are their relationships? How are they in the world? What are we representing? How do they relate? And there's different paradigms, right, of using dice and stats and skills and attributes, and the in many role-playing games, the way that you interact is about conflict, mostly physical conflict. And these days there's a lot more that embrace social conflict or internal elements. And then there's many games. I don't know if you guys have crossed a lot of the lyric role-playing games sort of flowering. It's happened on itch.io. There's an article about it. I can give it to you. It's from a couple of years ago.
Please.
Really fun stuff. And that is really great, because that's like, like poetry, taking the idea of playing a character and saying, well, that's just one part. That's a tip of the iceberg of what we can do. Right. And so there's a lot of people now thinking just about what's the experience we want. And that goes far beyond, certain types of conflict that involve swords, that may or may not involve swords.
Okay, I have to. I want to come back to this, but I have to ask, because we're heading in such an interesting direction here. You mentioned this, and I know it's in your bio, or well, it's in your Wikipedia bio. I don't know if that's legit or not, but we'll go with this. You mentioned you're a forester and conservationist, and that's not inherently related to RPG design. It is perhaps arguably tangentially related to, social theory and other stuff from college. How did you end up in forestry?
Well, let's see. So I studied economics and social theory in college because I wanted to know about society and how it worked and people and all that kind of fun stuff. And then I got to the end of my degree program and I said, oh, okay, what do I do now? And I didn't have an answer. So I kind of struggled and got, had like, the 3 jobs that you get when you get out of college, and you like still live with lots of friends. And then sometime later, I thought, okay, I'm living, but I don't have a direction.
Yeah.
What was important to me when I was young? What is important to me now?
Yeah.
And where I lived was an old farm community that still was along a river and had a lot of wooded space. I spent so much of my childhood outside, as many of us of my age were able to, for a variety of social reasons at the time, i.e. latchkey kid coming home. Yeah, is there somebody home? I don't know. I don't care. Me and my dog will be outside. And so those were formative years for me. And I thought, well, let's see, is there something I could do with that? And I looked into it, and forestry is a job. You could get a degree. At the time, the generational shift was said to be coming, so that there'd be a lot of people leaving that field. So there'd be positions opening. And so I studied, and the advisor I had at the time, who is now passed on, but he was a really, really wonderful communicator and educator. His deal was connecting people with the forest and helping people learn about, the science of it and the good management of it and how it fits into your life. And today, trees are on the horizon of everybody. Climate change has made it like number one. But through my career, trees have not been at all. Definitely, I've gotten some weird looks when I've been like looking out, looking out the window as I'm traveling. I'm like, oh, they're deciduous here. And I'm like, and people, you're looking at the trees. What? So it's really interesting to be at a time in history now where trees are so central to many people's thoughts about the future. It's challenging, it's good, but so for me, role-playing games were always something I loved to do with my friends. It's something I've, done most of my adult life. And when I learned I could write them too, I was just all over it. It was delightful. And for me, it's very much an art form that I love to engage in. And it is something that I've done professionally. I've been paid to write. I publish, I sell my games, but it's never been something that I personally have been able to live on.
Right.
And for me also, the things I was describing before, what I'm drawn to is not the mainstream of gaming.
Yeah.
So being that's always been fine with me. I like being at the edges because that's what I'm interested in, and it's totally fine with me if other people aren't interested in what I'm interested in. That's totally cool. And so that wasn't something I could make a career out of. And so it felt great to have a career or, job path that dealt with the environment that I felt passionately about, that I could feel good about getting up in the morning and working 8 hours to try and help conserve land and keep our world green.
That's awesome.
And so it's a nice balance for me.
So I'm curious what you think. Okay, maybe I'm taking an artistic license here, but since you started, I'm curious, like kind of putting those two worlds together, which obviously you do. In just like the past year-ish, I've started reading more like solar punk. And there's this stuff coming out now in the RPG world. I'm trying to think if it was I don't know if it was in Polygon or where, but it was a fairly large venue, and it was on Hope Punk, right? And these games that are coming out that are like very much responding to the dystopian themes that seem to have really been with us for the past decade in a lot of both large and indie games. And I can't help but listen to what you're saying in terms of RPGs being game design being narrative analysis, and then the importance of forestry and the environment and nature. Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, and I should tell everybody who doesn't have video, who's listening to us, that I'm commenting on the chat box there. But I'm curious what you think about just that. It seems maybe there's a shift in the landscape, no pun intended, but that maybe RPGs as an industry are going to shift to becoming what I would call and have in the past as bright green, right? More technologically savvy, more inclusive, more aware, more seen as an like what is it? Coyote and Crow, is that the one? I get the names wrong all the time. It's it's made some waves. I don't have it, but it's the Native American themed RPG. It's absolutely gorgeous. It's like a Hope Punk science fantasy, but again, it has a very deep nature theme, and it sounds like maybe this stuff is coming. I would love to pick your brain about that idea.
Yeah. I think that's wonderful. I hadn't seen that article before, but I searched for it and put the link in
You found it.
chat, and I will read it. And it's, I think that something that is great, that's a wonderful trend, is that there are more people at the table now. There are more people interested in role-playing games across the board. Like, we're in an utter flowering of interest in this field, like never before. More, I'm sure, people play or have heard about role-playing games than ever in history. And that's great. And also, it's not just white guys. So that's good too. You know, there's a lot of people all across the planet and in each country. And it's amazing to have Indigenous voices and First Nations speaking, and you know, there's a lot of really horrible history that we're all working with and struggling with and trying, many of us, to move away from and to forge new directions. So how awesome is it to have role-playing games be part of that? And here, let's get back to the role-playing games as literature. When you wrote that in your email to me when you asked if I wanted to talk with you, and I was like, yes, I do want to talk about that. And for me, I was thinking about a few different ways to take that. Like, are we talking about role-playing games that deal with literature? Those are awesome. That's wonderful. I have a friend who wrote one that's basically playing out Sense and Sensibility. It's a wonderful, really moving. It's called Growing Up. I'll put a link in the chat. And Anna Westerling, a Swedish game wrote that some time ago now. And I've written a LARP about Jane Austen, interweaving her life and several of her novels, so that you can, you know, sort of see them in parallel. And so there's just, literature stories are a wonderful realm. Oh, and The Good Society is another fantastic, relatively recent game that also deals with Jane Austen and that ilk, that period and setting. And so it's really ripe for being able to immerse yourself and to learn about and to play and enjoy yourself, and have the fields of interaction be different kinds of conflict. You know, that's social and class and hope, right? And frustration and you know, your lifelong path, and the choices and the things you have to give up in order to do that sometimes, to succeed or to survive. So that's one way to look at it. And then also some of the things that you folks and I were chatting about before you hit record, were thinking about the books that we have and reading them as literature, as something to read, not just a textbook, not just a manual. Although I think role-playing games are kind of a fascinating hybrid of so many different things. You know, they can be poetry, they can be like a user's manual. The index is such a critical piece, and yet many don't have them or have terrible ones, or you know, like it's like it can be a piece of poetic inspiration for your play. You know, it's like the Eddas, with these vast epic sagas that we play out. And then, you know, another way to think about it is that using literature as a sort of metaphor, you know, literature can be, you think about written literature, but then there's also poetry that you speak, or there's storytelling. And then for me, role-playing games really sit within the field of narrative experiences, and that's vast and broad. And in each society, there are many ways that comes about. It could be shadow puppets. It could be spoken poetry or epic that's never written down, that has to be passed from word, you know, mouth to mouth, you know, from one person's mouth to another person's ears, and then passed down. And you know, you hear about storytelling of the Homeric epics, where you would just have people tell them over how many hours and take turns giving each piece, or and I like going back to the Greek because there's a few metaphors or there's a few frameworks there that I think are really neat, like the muses, right? The 9 muses is what we think of from a certain period. And each of them represents different types of art or science. And I when the first time I learned what they actually are for, I was kind of stunned, because I always sort of thought, oh, well, there'd be like a muse for writing or stories, but there's a muse for epic poetry, there's a muse for theater and arts, there's a muse for erotic poetry. Like, they're different muses for different kinds of narrative. And also there's muses for science, or Uranias for like astrology or the stars. And so for me, I like thinking of those different personifications of art to help sort of think about the ways that our society has many different storytelling forms, and each of them have so much potential, and many of them sort of take the central place in our society. Like film is huge, like that's one of the most powerful storytelling mediums of our time. And novels are very well entrenched, and television is another related medium, but also has its own particulars. And then there's the little nobody in the corner that's role-playing games that gets forgotten or isn't known about or is weird, or why would you want to do that, or what is it? What I've had this conversation so many times. What do you do? What exactly? Like, okay, so you sit down at a table and then you talk. What do you talk about? And it's very hard to put into words what you do, but it is sort of like I'm sure I've made this comparison before, but it's like music, right? You can go to a symphony and you can listen to a concert, and there's trained professionals, and or you can have a recorded album of some sort, and it's beautiful. Or you can sit down with somebody and they're on the piano and you've got your guitar and your or your violin, and you're just jamming together. And that's what we're doing when we play role-playing games. We're jamming together and we're making stories together.
Great analogy.
I gotta say, this conversation a little bit is blowing my mind. I mean, we've talked with some really, we've talked with some really interesting people, but I don't think I've ever been forced or invited to just look at the whole idea from really a fresh perspective. This is pretty cool.
Oh, that's awesome. Yay.
Yeah, so keep going. I didn't mean to cut you. This is fascinating.
This is exactly the direction we kind of so you were kind of saying what did when it came to RPGs and literature, for us it's all the above. Whether it's a Sense and Sensibility, or whether, like you're talking about, as an artistic medium or a means of narration and history and all that, it can go in so many different places, and I think all of them are important in terms of being part of the discussion. It's something, it can be, like you said, something as simple as, when you're designing a game, are you designing it with the idea, like you said, is it and there's no wrong answer here. It's just, are you designing it like a manual, or are you designing it like, in effect, a novel that has the RPG and understanding the gaming components into it? Is it a hybrid? Whatever the case may be, and where are you taking your inspiration from, for it? So
Exactly.
This notion of shared storytelling across all of these different media, RPGs being one of them, right? And the jamming I love, especially since Brad's been playing with guitar and I've been playing poorly with piano. That no pun intended, that really resonates. But okay, so this is cheating a bit, but like as you're talking about this, Emily, and blowing our minds. So I think back to when my girls were little, like elementary school age, right?
Totally.
Where it was much easier to impress them. Right, like and it was like, these were much like, this is a good idea, let's try it, and there wasn't a lot of screening or vetting, at least to try it once. And Brad's got teen, you got a teen and a young adult, but I think so every so nature is very, very significant for me, both personally and professionally. And every year, my family and I, with my wife's parents, go up to the Gunflint Trail up by the BWCA, and just
just for those that are listening, and for me,
oh,
BWCA,
sorry, Boundary
Waters.
Waters Canoe Area. It's
Okay.
it is the, well, so for Emily, it is the largest designated wilderness in the Forest Service. It is also the original designated wilderness in the National Wilderness System. It's an amazing place. But I mentioned this because, I mean, years ago, like we go up every year, but years ago, I had found, I don't remember who, and I feel badly. I don't remember who the company was who came up with this neat idea. It was clearly like some individual, a smaller concern, but they're essentially story dice. And there are a number of these, but these were, you know what I'm talking about. These were like if you went to like a really good game store, and I don't mean an RPG store. I mean like a little game store, like with board games and whatnot. Largely for kids. So you could get these packs, and they were like story cubes, and so they were like dice, but each side had an icon, right? Very congruent with what we're talking about. And of course, I got a little carried away, so I picked up the sci-fi one, I picked up the fantasy one. Those never sold as well. The girls were growing out. But the one time we went up with the original ones, and my in-laws often would like to, actually, to your point exactly, Emily, they'd want to one or two nights we'd sit in a circle, obligatorily it was, and we would generate a story, and it was pretty silly. But one time I tried that with the girls while we were up there, just with these dice, and right, so you had a bit of a randomization element, and it was, that's what comes to mind, right? It was just this silly, super simple mechanic, but it allowed for that shared storytelling, and the narrative was, powerfully affected by whatever was on the mind of the individual, be they 70 or 7. And the goal was, okay, you have a start and you have a finish, and anything in the middle is fair game.
That's awesome.
It was pretty cool. Yeah. I mean, didn't do it a whole bunch of times, but it was very akin to what you've been describing for us of there was that deep narrative element, but and it wasn't even necessarily performative. It was just, we were telling a story and we didn't know where we were jamming, right? You didn't know where it was going to go.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that excites me the most about role-playing games, is that you're writing rules that help people tell stories together.
Yeah.
And that's pretty incredible. That's really incredible. Storytelling is a real art, and there's amazing storytellers out there. In fact, right now we're in the middle of the WGA strike that's going on.
Yes.
Because there's structural inequities that are stripping people of their historically copyright protected rights.
Yes.
To be paid for the work that they're doing. And the new technologies that we have, streaming platforms and just different agreements that are being made, are taking away those rights. So it's a really important struggle that's going on. And, that seems like a far distance from the campsite, but it's not.
There was just an article, the WGA had a post. I think I saw it out. Maybe I saw it through Twitter, but about the introduction not to take it in a weird direction, the introduction of AI.
No, that's real. I mean, that bears on everything you just said, Emily. I mean, my God. Yeah.
AI as a means of content creation. And don't get me wrong, I've been out on Chat GPT and I've played around and all that in a humorous, Jason laughs, because
for like 2 weeks, Emily, I would just get texts from Brad. He was so deep into this. And they were fascinating and a little frightening. It would be like, I asked Chat GPT to create an adventure for blah blah blah, and he'd paste it, and it's like, well, this is playable, but of course, I mean, if for anyone who knows anything about how that works, the mechanics, no pun intended, of Chat GPT, right, that's the quality, the strength of that is second the programming, and first it's the data set, it's it's what has gone into it, what databases, is it Wikipedia, is it novels, right? It could only make an adventure for Star Trek Adventures for Brad and me because it could access that material, which does bring us right back to the WGA writer's strike, because again, we're talking about ultimately this all rests on the creativity of these really creative humans.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And I think when we write role-playing games, and when we write anything, and when we play role-playing games, we're also relying on that bank of knowledge and creativity that we've experienced.
Yeah.
So there's that. But we're acknowledging it, or we're adding our own creative spark to it. And there's there's a person involved, and we haven't quite yet reached the point in our epic journey towards the cybernetic future of cyberpunk where the robots have citizenship. We'll get there eventually, I'm sure.
Yep.
But right now we're still in this place where ChatGPT basically is strip mining other people's creativity.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly it. Yeah.
So, and then we have the situation where literal humans who created things like, I don't know if either of you've seen the show Abbott Elementary. It's a fantastic, one of the best shows I've ever seen, and it's a network show.
Oh,
crazy that. And it's about teachers teaching in an elementary school, and it's a primarily Black school, and so they are doing an amazing job working with all of the limitations that entails. It's teaching in our society and dealing with racism and structural inequalities. So, and it's so funny and so touching, like really human. It's just just a really, really great show. And, I've read interviews with some of the writers who are saying, yeah, we are getting very little to nothing for this incredible work. And that's actually like kind of what happens to artists.
And a network show.
Yeah, a network show.
Wow.
Yeah, not even a streaming platform, but it's a network show.
So speaking of really, really creative and important, reflections of what's going on, I wonder if you'll tell us a little bit about Black and Green Games.
Oh, sure.
Maybe start. Well, we would love to know, but especially starting with the name. It's got to mean something.
Yeah. Oh, wow. People don't ask about that very often. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I really the forest and nature is very important to me.
Yeah.
I grew up around a lot of trees. Black and green are colors of trees. You often see that the bark is black and the leaves are green. So to me, it just sort of fits well. And the image that I chose as my sort of logo is a crow and with a green background. And I have a crow tattoo. I have a oak leaf tattoo. They're meaningful to me. And so I think for me, it sort of is about those as symbols of creativity in life. And it's just, when you name a game or you name a company, it's good to find something that you like and you're comfortable with. And then it just becomes background, either it means something or it doesn't.
Sure.
But so that's where it came from for me.
So tell us about the company though. I mean,
so let's see, back in those 2000s that I talked about before, when I was part of this gaming community that was talking about writing games and playing and really pushing and helping each other to publish. And part of the reason why that conversation happened at that time was because there were technological things available that hadn't been before. Print on demand was becoming accessible to individuals in a way that it hadn't been before. Before, you really, in order to print things at any kind of scale, you had to go whole hog. And so you have stories about people putting a mortgage on their house to get 10,000 copies of a game text that then doesn't sell. And you're like, boxes of role-playing games sitting in your basement and you're underwater on your mortgage. Like that's a nightmare scenario that has happened to at least someone. And so it's terrible. Don't do that. No. Don't do that, kids. Don't do that at home. Not even with adult supervision, especially not with adult supervision. Much better to make a nice, lovely PDF and put it out there and sell it or not. It's not going to break into the bank. It's not going to sit in your attic. And so we were able to do that. That's PDFs became something that you could make, and it was possible to get the Creative Suite and do your own layout or work with a friend who had some knowledge.
Mhm,
So that's when I got involved and threw up a little website and, worked on that breaking the ice game where you played people who going on a date, and people were kind enough to play it. So I got a lot of play testing in various places, and I brought my little game book to Gen Con, and I was at the Forge booth and we put it
Wow,
there, and I sold some. It
that's
wasn't
cool.
like millions, but people liked it. And Ken Haidt was kind enough to write about it in a article that he had at that time. And so it just, I was very lucky to be able to get a little bit of interest in what I was doing. So it made sense to keep doing it. And I have met a lot of people and have learned so much over the years. And it's been really a wonderful sort of experience for me.
That's really neat. And I mean, it's so fitting. I mean, not just we're all of a certain age here, give or take a couple. And so, you think back to like the aughts versus now in the 20s, right? And this has just the whole printing, publishing, writing industry across fields for good and bad, right? Good, bad, and ugly, all of it. There's been so much change, but on the good side, as you've said, I think the ability for writers, for publishers, for creatives to get their work out, courtesy of the technology. Like I'm an inveterate physical book person, right? I've tried it. Brad knows this. I mean, you're very much the same, I think, Brad, but I've tried digital this or that, and I love it, but it's not real to me until I can have that visceral physical interaction. If I can't smell the print, it's not there for me yet, right? In the paper. But the fact is, the market for PDFs and whatnot is so much larger than that. And especially when just like you said, you maybe you're not dialing in from your third house all because of your game, royalties.
Yeah,
but also the flip side of that is because of work that you do, the way you do it, and others, so many people can access it. I mean, think of all the people who either aren't sure if they want to commit to a new game, a new system, or more emphatically, who can't justify dropping $50, $60 on a core rulebook they might enjoy reading but might never play. And with PDF, I mean, you started us here earlier this evening when we were chatting about just the ability of the RPG land to be increasingly beautifully inclusive. Part of it is the PDF shift. Don't you think that people can get there now? And I mean, and so many people are even putting things out there for free, especially when they're new, of just, hey, just for my joy, play my game, try my adventure. For your joy, we'll tell the story together, even if we never meet.
Exactly. There's a really wonderful practice in the itch.io RPG community where people have community games or community copies. That's what it is. So they'll sell their game, but they'll say, and here's 10 copies that people can get for free.
Yeah.
And go ahead. And then sometimes I think people say, if I sell X number, then I'll have 10 more free copies.
That's awesome.
It's just this nice balance between really honoring the fact that, who can pay $50 over and over again on games or ever, and wanting to be able to share that experience and be honored for your work as a creator, it's kind of a beautiful thing.
Yeah, it really is.
I think it's something you bring up too that we haven't really talked about. Is it's just this idea we've talked about different delivery medium. Itch.io is one of those growing ones as well.
Yeah.
I've been out there for other content, and I've gone through and looked at. I'm the type that will pick up a PDF, and if it's not 400 pages, I'll actually send it to FedEx and have them wire bind, or spiral bind it. Which reminds me, before we wrap up, it was just we were talking about literature. I picked up, there's a book that recently came out called The Solo Game Master, about playing games solo, and even Lord of the Rings.
Out. So that's published by Fate, right?
No, by Modifius.
That's the Modifius one.
Yeah, the Solo Game Master guy, and like Free League, who does publishing that does the new One Ring, they came out with what's called the Strider rule set for solo role play.
Delightful.
And I haven't had really a lot of time, like Jason said. We haven't had a lot of time to game, but one of the things I did pick up was, in effect, just like a Moleskine notebook, and play the game using those rules, and in effect, what is the result? You're writing a story in that environment.
Right.
It's in effect short stories that are generated by your own gameplay, maybe using the dice or what other mechanic is. But there's another way of doing it, and I'm seeing an increase, and I've seen it out on itch.io, which I'm glad you brought it up. That's what made me think of it, is people are now even producing those stories as content. They're writing the game and then they're writing these stories.
Yeah.
And there's the literature. You could see the story and you could see the mechanic and the engine behind it. So yeah. Hey, thank you so much for coming. This idea of, we'll have to have you back again.
Oh,
if you
please.
I'd love to. That'd be great to talk more.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. It's mind blown. Seriously. This is so, and I mean, I'll just stop. This is so cool. Yeah.
I just thought it made my night when you started talking about it. And then it made my night again when you got Jason to not talk, because I could just see, on his jokes aside, I know I've known him for a long time. And when he literally is processing something that is profound to him, I can see it in his face, and that's what I saw. And and obviously I never see it when I talk to him.
I was going to say, it's why you beat me to it. It's why I keep interrupting Brad.
Yeah. So that's why I never see it. So just to see that tonight and to see him
No,
with
but
that face,
I mean it because we really, I mean, this isn't fan service at all. We really appreciate it, Emily. Brad and I have been talking at the fringes because of our own ignorance, but still some passion here about this. And you offering this little master class on, well, you thought about it this way. I mean, but truly thank you, because this will in the coming months manifest in more episodes because of what you've given us. This is just really, really, really neat. We would love to talk to you in the future. Man, just so interesting.
I highly recommend reading. I think I sent you the link for the article from a couple years ago talking about lyric role-playing games, and itch.io is just full of wonderful, wonderful games. Many, many solo games, as you mentioned. Yeah. And I've had that experience too, where I played one by a good friend, Alexa Faye McDaniel, called Strange Changeling Child. And I played it and I just found myself, writing. And it felt like there's this story of this character coming out. So I'm really glad you asked the question, and I'm thrilled that it's open, made you have some new thoughts, and I'd love to talk again.
Brad, that was such an interesting discussion we had with Emily. Two things to address right out of the gate, as it were. First of all, we apologize for the suspicious audio quality, not up to our normal standards. Specifically, I'm referring to the, shall we call them, duck farts coming from Brad's side of the recording.
How many times have you edited out some of my shenanigans in our?
Well, that's what they sound like.
Yes, and you're gonna let that pass. But you're not going to let Air Biscuit pass. Air Biscuit did not pass muster for you at one point in the past, but
there was no muster involved. Anyways, we will be more cognizant of that going forward. Going back to this just really intriguing chat with Emily Care-Boss, I wanna single out something she said, and I thought this was the neatest thing, that game design is a form of narrative analysis. Yeah. Discuss.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't even, until that came up in the conversation.
Yeah.
I will plead extraordinary ignorance, because it never just came up on the radar. I never processed that way.
No. And that was one of those points in our chat with Emily where it was like, wait, hold on a second. What? This is new. This is interesting. But let's talk about that game design as narrative analysis. I really, really, really love this concept of it's one thing to say, like we've been talking amongst the two, just not on air, but with the two of us, for, as you said, for some time, that RPGs make for fascinating literature, potentially. But Emily's observation that there's more to it, that the actual mechanics allow for narrative analysis, that the actual mechanics play a fundamental narrative role in how we understand the world, the story, etc. It's one thing to say, okay, with, for example, the Genesis narrative dice system, still my favorite. Well, I mean, it's in the name. It's a narrative dice system, but you don't. I never thought of that still as like narratively analytical, right? And it's still something I know you're squinting and pondering, and I'm kind of doing the same thing.
Yeah,
I'm
because this
still
is not
thinking
something
about this.
we did not have this discussion or prep this beforehand. So as we're talking,
No.
the wheels are churning.
Yeah,
So
and I love that. But
Mhm.
this notion of, once in a while I teach courses in qualitative analysis, and I always have to at least touch upon narrative analysis, but from a research non-literary standpoint of, okay, people are going to tell you, subjects will tell you stories about their experiences, and you try to draw information from that. But this, I think back to the English faculty with whom I worked better than a decade ago, and there are a number of them I would just, oh, I can think of one just lovely guy. I would so like to pick his brain, like, what do you think about this? Because he was all into Stephen King. That was a scholarship, and like he'd be all over this.
Yeah.
But talk about a series of books that would lend themselves to role playing.
Oh,
But just game design mechanics, all is narrative analysis. I can't even fully explain it, which I find very provocative. It's just very cool.
well, I think, and you bring it. Um, you can hear me, right? There was just a weird noise that popped up. So
To quote Homer Simpson, just because I don't care or look like I wasn't listening doesn't mean I
I
don't
mean, I don't
understand.
understand.
Right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Thanks for that.
You're welcome.
I'm giving you a
A one finger
non-editable.
wave.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's why we're audio
Jason.
people.
Jason, you are number one. Um,
I'm flattered.
um, the idea of this never crossed my mind. I think something too that was interesting that really caught my attention, and it's a very specific. Well, not enough
You got
coffee
it.
today.
You're good.
The idea of using RPGs to create lit.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I've looked at this idea, and I'll talk about some of the latest updates with my game stuff in the GM corner.
Excellent.
But this idea of potentially solo playing some of these gaming systems that are designed that can work in a solo environment,
Yeah,
and creating and writing stories using the mechanic. So it's not directly related to as RPG as lit, but that came up in the discussion, and using the RPG as a creative mechanism.
and okay, so it's funny you say that, because I was just doing what all good researchers do in 2023, and I Googled it.
Yes.
And that took me actually to one of the journal sites, and just exactly what you said of narrative analysis in this arena being an attempt to form a cohesive story
Yeah.
around the bits and pieces. And that's just another way of putting what you just said.
Yeah. And that's a much more eloquent way of indicating it. It's just, to me, it's fascinating, and it's something you and we've talked.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff we obviously talk about because we talk so regularly. We have more time to game now. We are focusing kind of right now within two arenas. We're focusing with an STA, and we're focusing within the age mechanic. Those are the two that are on our radar. That allows us to dive deeper because now we have the time. But I'll be honest with you, we've done it with the age mechanic. It's really good for that.
Oh God,
and
yes.
With the 2D20 and the Modifius 2D20 mechanic.
Yeah.
Having played now a couple episodes of you GMing our first Star Trek adventure.
Yep.
It played out. I think one of the things we both said at different points, this played out like an episode. It read and played out like whether you were reading a novel or
Yes.
whether you were watching an episode of one of the shows.
And so let's as we typically do, let's cross the fourth wall for a sec about that. So we had a sesh 0 together to just kind of set up your PC, with me kind of leaning over your digital shoulder just so that we could both kind of see how that felt for the system.
And we should qualify, when we are playing right now, we are playing with the idea that we are learning. It's a sandbox experience for
Exactly. And so we've had 3 sessions, 1 short adventure, and we're using one of the starter adventures from Modiphius. And they're, like you said, we got through that, and small bites intentionally. And it felt like we were in an episode of Trek. It felt like we were in an episode somewhere between TNG and Picard, right? Because it was a TNG era that then we homebrewed a bit for Picard.
Well, let's just say you did a really good job of homebrewing and in effect tweaking it to work within the timeline that we wanted to play.
Yeah, no, thanks. But we didn't have to do much because it's so well written. And that's exactly what Emily, I think, was talking about. And so now our next time we play, we're gonna play, well, you know what? I'll keep that for the GM corner, or that's something worth talking about. I won't get into that.
I think point being though is I think this idea, one of the things that came out for me, something very simplistic to me but profound, was this idea of air quote RPG as lit. That's too narrow a phrase to define what we really are talking about.
Yeah. Emily helped us get further.
Yes, it's the intersection of literature and RPGs.
That's much better.
That's it, or the intersection, or where they are, where they run, tangentially close, or whatever the case may be.
Both with the world building, as well as with the mechanics and game design, which we started getting into when we were chatting with Emily, but we kept wandering because there was so much to talk about.
Oh yeah, we didn't get through probably 30% of what we wanted, which is always the case when we have any of our guests on.
That's why she has to come back. Yeah,
and we always tell folks it's an organic conversation. This conversation we had this week with Emily just really coincided with some of the stuff I've been working through from a gaming perspective, because I'm still in the job hunt. I have more time than I've had in a long time. And like I mentioned before, I had actually created as kind of a list of games that are
cool.
These are the ones that we are focusing on, that we are focusing on right now. And right now for us, the 2 main focus areas are the Age system, Modern Age, and the Expanse specifically, and the Star Trek Adventures, with the idea that I'm waiting for 2nd edition Fantasy Age to drop, as well as the 5th season RPG. That's still sitting out there too, remember.
You pre-ordered that, didn't you?
I did. It's a backer kit purchase, so I backed that one.
Yeah, that is a good looking. Again, you were saying earlier, in terms of the aesthetics of some of these, that is a good looking rulebook.
Yeah. Oh yeah. But I like this idea of using RPG materials as to write or tell stories myself as a creative mechanism.
Yeah.
And so more in the coming weeks, but you're the one that introduced me or showed me the Iron Sworn Sword Forged.
I was really system. I watched that. What it was, don't remember, was it a Kickstarter? There was something.
It was a Kickstarter.
And I just watched the whole thing, and the little video they dropped. I just found the whole world very compelling.
Yeah, so I had some credit, because at this point, since I'm in job hunting and all that, I am not in any position where I can go and splurge on material. But
you have purchased so much from a publisher that you had enough credit to buy a rule book outright.
Oh, I had more than a credit to buy more than one.
More than one rule book, I
know. And a couple dice sets too.
Oh my God, that's right.
So I ordered it through  as well as another set, but the one that came in that I've had. I don't think I've even talked to you about it. Maybe I have real briefly. Two of them, and they come from Free League or Free League Publishing.
Yep.
One is Forbidden Lands, which is a very kind of different take on, and it's really more low fantasy than high fantasy. And it's kind of got like a darky grittiness to it.
Yeah.
But it lends itself to solo play or duet play.
Oh, interesting.
As well as Tales from the Loop.
Yeah, the concept and the artwork intrigue me.
Yeah, it has a very, obviously the 80s that never was. It has a very, it comes from a time period when we were kids.
Very kind of a Spielbergian feel, but not dystopian.
Well, just people tend to say it's kind of like E.T. meets the Goonies meets Stranger Things. It's kind of what
at least visually that makes sense.
That's kind of the vibe. Those are ones that have and even some of these Free League games tend to lend themselves to kind of like some solo play. And so I've set that up amongst other things we're working on. It's not a real high priority for me. But the creative juices were moving after our discussion.
Nice.
With Emily. And so I am eagerly awaiting the domestic shipment of Ironsworn to come in. But in the meantime,
Ironsworn? No, of Starforge.
Starforge. Ironsworn Starforge.
Yeah, right.
It's the next iteration.
Yeah.
Thank you. I
same mention.
Yep. Yeah. And so waiting for that to come in, but in the meantime, I have Forbidden Lands that I am.
Nice. Yeah, we'll have to talk about that.
Yeah, so these are in the future, but our big focus has been playing through, like we talked about, STA, and since we've doing that, and you've been kind of leading, I'll pass that over to you because I think there were a couple of things you wanted to mention with that amongst other stuff that's been on your desk.
Actually, I'm going to surprise you, and just briefly address something that I haven't mentioned that is though very relevant to what you just said. The other night, one of my daughters and I watched Dungeons and Dragons: Honor Among Thieves.
Yes, you texted me.
I texted you a few times. I will say the quote, "That is one pudgy dragon."
You said you texted me.
I know. I thought, I can't believe I just heard that in a movie. This is such a fun movie. That really fits the movie. It was here's why I'm bringing this up. Obviously it's D&D. It was produced by apparently the production company out of Hasbro.
Yep.
And what is it, E1? And it was really interesting. I felt badly for my daughter because I would explain things as we were watching.
Oh boy.
Exactly. But here's why I'm bringing this up though, Brad. And this is what I think you might really enjoy. So it really was D&D.
Really? Was it?
It really was D&D. So you have a fighter, a druid, a wizard, a bard, and a paladin. You have
all walk into a bar and
exactly. Well, that's not too far from true. You have humans, you have tieflings, you have other things. You go to the underworld, to the Underdark, and it looks inspired by the Dritz novels.
Oh.
The scenery is beautiful. The locations are beautiful. And I don't want to say anything disparaging. This was not Lord of the Rings. I'll put it that way. But it was neat.
That wasn't the intent.
That's right. It was not the intent. It really felt like, oh, this is like a playable day-to-day world. Like it happens, it starts in Icewind Dale. It occurs on Faerun, right? All of these things, both mentioned and simply implied, either through dialogue or visually. So, when your parent company owns the canon, you can do this.
You can play.
Yeah. But that was neat, Brad. It was literally in Forgotten Realms D&D canon, and cool. It was cool, and it was fun and cute. It was just dark and heavy enough to keep adults interested. I would absolutely feel comfortable watching it with like a 10 or 12-year-old. There are only a couple of naughty words and they're not even the bad ones.
Okay.
And you know me, I'm a real stickler with that stuff.
Well, no, yeah, I mean,
even now my girls are in high school and it's still like one of my daughters said hell the other day. I'm like, excuse me?
hey, I think I've told you, not to digress too far, I have never heard my children swear.
Yeah,
And
right,
that is
right.
not, and embarrassingly enough, it's not for the lack of
It is not.
them hearing it
No,
from
no,
me.
true.
But I'm pretty comfortable saying I don't think either of them do it with their friends either. I don't think it's in their language.
Yeah.
So going back to that point
Yeah.
is that I would expect no less from your girls, and you're much more eloquent with
Well,
the verbal word than I am. It's if I get a profane word out of you, it's normally because you stubbed your toe really bad, or
you
I
got
did something to really irritate you or humor you, which
yeah,
the
that's fair.
first tends to be more prevalent, more
I don't know.
prominent.
Well, I did use some profanity the other evening when we were role playing, but that was very intentional for your benefit
Yes.
because the NPC was taking after a character from Letterkenny.
Yes.
And I knew it would be appreciated. Anyways, my point about the movie though is um it was just fun. It actually it I've never said this about a movie before. It sounds super corny, but it had heart. Like I had read
Okay.
somewhere that this was like Chris Pine at his best, where he's got a bit of depth. He's a shuckster, but that's just the veneer.
Yeah.
And he's not trying to be overly serious. It really it was just fun. And like I think about our friend Aaron, right? My friend and colleague, and like we still are planning on getting him into D&D. He's just been busy. And
Yep.
like I could see prescribing this movie for him. Hey, watch it. In fact, we were going to go to the theater and we couldn't make it work, and so I streamed it. But I could see prescribing this for someone who is new to D&D and want to get in, because it would just give you this, like, it was just cool. It was just like, oh, so you
Okay,
have
let me
all,
ask you this though.
yeah, it was just cool.
Would either of our wives sit through the movie?
In fact, mine made it 15, maybe 20 minutes because her phone got too boring.
Oh, okay.
So no,
Then
hard
no.
no,
Okay. Okay.
no.
That's okay.
Our wives would not. But if you're,
Ours are pretty similar in terms of
yeah,
their
yeah,
interests in our activities related to this podcast and
that's right.
gaming in general.
And in
So
most things really they do.
yes.
But
Yeah.
but that's okay. No, not at all. My older daughter was like, "Oh." She couldn't help it. She stood for like 5 minutes, maybe closer to 10, behind the couch watching. And then it was finally, I'm going downstairs. But
God.
but I think for anyone who enjoys some fantasy,
Yeah.
right? Or and it was cute. And so I bring it up because again, akin to what you were saying in terms of One Ring and all this the other, the Free League stuff, and then see now I'm doing it. Starforged. It goes back to what we were chatting about with Emily, that the movie was constructed in a kind of a nice, unassuming way where, like, you think about the stuff in Forgotten Realms where you've got all these different species and history, and there's this deep history, and they just played it off like this is literally just like walking down the street every day and no one bats an eye. And that I thought was neat and relevant to, this notion of narrative analysis in literature, because it was all background until it had to be foreground, and then it was background again.
See, I am very behind. I was able to keep up with Picard. But I am behind in a lot of other stuff. I really got into watching. I think there's kind of like this running undercurrent with us because of the show Letterkenny.
Yeah, oh
which
my God.
which for many it is a show written by Jared Kizo, a Canadian, and it is about rural northern Canada, but it's a real dichotomy because it plays off as rural Northern Canada, but very progressive. I bring that up because there's an undercurrent of our humor these days that plays off of it, because there's a lot of cute, whether it's on TikTok or YouTube Shorts, there's a lot of material that's viral.
Yeah, I haven't even watched it. I think I've seen one actual episode, but between you and my own searches, I've seen so many clips.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And literally there is a real tinge of Letterkenny, a real flavor of it in our Star Trek adventures, because if you ever watch it, my character's name is based off of Squirrely Dan, and the NPC is
and then
based off of Shorzy.
I gave you an NPC who almost got killed.
Yep.
But
So, but that being said, it's on. I'm going to have to watch it. I end up turning the TV off at night because I read or I do our stuff. And I'll be honest, I got back into my Star Trek Online account, and I've been a little bit
you have.
I know,
because I'll get these random texts.
Yeah.
And like it'll be like a screenshot, or you're like, I just got the so and so, and it's like, oh, he's gone deep.
Well, and what we did is I used the game as a vehicle.
Was very cool.
I actually went out and picked up a Pathfinder class ship, which is the next generation version of the Intrepid, which was what the Voyager was. And our ship in our Star Trek universe is the USS Superior Trail.
Yep, beautiful.
Based off of the name of the trail that
we hike.
You and your brother regularly hike. I hiked one year before almost dying. And
that's another episode.
That's another whole other episode. So if you think I'm sometimes incoherent on here, get me dehydrated out in the middle of the trail.
That was specifically an episode of heat exhaustion, but go on.
Oh yeah, that was. I think we were approaching heat stroke at that point. We were.
Well, by you,
but
yes,
me. But Superior Trail is the name of the ship, and I use Star Trek Online.
And you put on the call number and everything.
Yeah, and I went into the bridge. I don't think I've sent those to you, but I took pictures of, because you can choose the bridge and everything like that. I set the bridge up. So the ship is all set in the game just as a vehicle so that I could take the pictures for us to use with Star Trek Adventures. And that is a testament to, folks that were involved. Think about it. Who are the folks that we've talked to? Thomas Maroney, Aaron Palea, and all these folks that were.
Thomas and Aaron, they're all over, especially Thomas. I mean, my God, right? His work is now canon in Picard. Incredible.
Yeah, I have an Odyssey class. I have a limited run. They called it a temporal Odyssey class cruiser, which is a cruiser that's fitted based off of a different timeline. I won't get into the specifics on it, but it is a cool looking ship. If you went out and looked at the Odyssey class and look how different it from a portrait mode, it looks like a normal traditional Star Trek ship, but the way it's constructed, if you look at it nose on, it's different. But just how detailed they designed these ships and the material. I have a Vengeance class ship. That's my primary ship, which is the Kelvin class ship from Marcus. But yeah, I picked up the Superior Trail.
I think a way to close so that we can lie to ourselves that we didn't drift at all in the GM corner. Yeah. I often think about this, actually, especially having watching Picard season 3 so recently. When Thomas Morone was with us, he talked about designing some of these ships, and he talked about the thought process, and it wasn't just designing shells. He remember this. He would ask himself, okay, what's the inside look like? What are the needs, etc., etc. These ships are world building elements. These ships are absolutely narrative elements.
Aaron specifically talked about this.
Yes,
the ships as members of the crew. I'll post it out on Twitter. I think Dave Blass posted it, because there's the story about the Titan, now the Enterprise G. Sorry, I've given it away if you haven't watched Picard.
Yep.
It's time. It's a Constitution 3 class, or what they call a Neocon.
Yep.
It is the Titan A, and everyone's like, well, the Titan was not I think it was a Luna class. I can't remember. I think it was Luna class. Yep. And they were like, well, how did it go from being a Luna class as a refit to a Constitution class? They look very different. And so they did some concept design where they showed the Luna ship below in a space dock, the new Titan
being refit from the Titan.
And they're using the materials. And in effect, the refit is like a rebuild using the original Titan material. So it's just, they go into that type of depth to show how those ships are crew.
And it's all about story.
Yeah, it's all about story. So yeah.
All right, everybody.
It was a great episode.
As always, clearly we're rambling a little bit this evening, but you know what? It's hard not to. After that chat with Emily, it has really got us thinking. And days later, we are still thinking about this.
Oh yeah.
Definitely more to come. And with that, we realize we say this just about every time, but we've got some more really interesting people, really fun conversations coming your way. As always, be well, stay well. We will see you in a couple weeks.